Killer who stole. Wait. Killers who stole their victims' identity.
On the night of July 1st, 1997, a severe fire broke out at a small white bungalow on 50th Avenue in East Oakland, California. It looked like a deliberate attack meant to end a life. But within days, that fire would become a national story that fooled not only the police and the media, but even the White House. By the time firefighters arrived, the house was fully engulfed in flames. Moments after, a badly burned woman came out of the house and made her way to a neighbor's door. That neighbor, Monica Joy Boyd, knew the two sisters who lived there, Stevie Allman and Sarah Mitchell. They looked alike enough that people sometimes mistook them for twins. But the burns on the woman in front of Monica were so severe that she couldn't tell which sister she was looking at. The woman told responders someone had thrown something flammable through her window. She identified herself to paramedics as 52-year-old Stevie Allman. According to her, drug dealers had surrounded the house and thrown Molotov cocktails through the window in retaliation for years of her reporting drug activity and giving police video of deals outside the home. Stevie was known as a responsible and dependable person. She'd lived in that house for years, and according to family, she'd been the one stable presence in her younger sister Sarah's life, letting her stay for free, covering for her when things fell apart. But that summer, Stevie had reached her limit and told Sarah it was time to move out. As the ambulance pulled away, neighbors gathered outside the burning house and started asking about her sister Sarah. She told them Sarah had moved out of state weeks earlier, but before she could answer any more questions, she was rushed to the Alta Bates Medical Center in Berkeley. Within days, reporters came to the hospital to interview her and ask her about the attack. Stevie issued a public statement from her hospital bed, urging neighbors to keep up the fight against drugs. About a week later, she wrote a 3-page handwritten letter that was released to the press. It is difficult to imagine people could be this cruel. I have no doubt they intended to murder me and burn my house down on top of me. The story of a 52-year-old woman standing up to drug dealers spread quickly and became much bigger than a neighborhood fire. Well-wishers across the country sent her cards and letters, as well as donations totaling more than $4,700. Local contractors offered to rebuild the home, and California Governor Pete Wilson announced a $50,000 reward to help police find whoever was behind the attack. Even the White House called the hospital to pay their regards. By that point, Stevie had become a symbol of ordinary people standing up to violence in their own neighborhoods. But this narrative fell apart within just 2 weeks when the truth broke out from Stevie's own family. Another sister to Stevie and Sarah had seen the news coverage from the hospital. Even through the burns, something about the woman's behavior on screen didn't sit right. She filed a missing persons report for Stevie Allman, which was a strange thing to do for someone who is supposedly the one lying on the hospital bed. So, when police asked...
We can? Yeah. Bro, literally the whole week, I'm recording when I get the... on when everybody else... What time you gonna get the... I know I'm getting that in the morning.
The sister about her suspicions, she said Stevie was a quiet and private person. Stevie would never have filmed drug dealers. She wouldn't have even acknowledged them. She would have looked the other way. She wouldn't do anything. Now, this might sound like a strange reason to question someone's identity, but she wasn't identifying her sister from a scar or a facial feature. She was identifying her from her personality, something only a sibling who grew up with her would know. Investigators who were already chasing suspects behind the firebombing now had to consider whether the woman recovering in the hospital was actually who she claimed to be. When police brought her in, Stevie denied everything. However, after going through her belongings, investigators found 2 IDs inside her wallet, one for Sarah Mitchell and one for Stevie Allman. So they took her fingerprints, and the results came back to a match to a previous arrest made 26 years earlier in 1971. The woman in the hospital was Sarah Mitchell, which raised a disturbing question. If Sarah was pretending to be her sister, where was the real Stevie? On July 15th, investigators went back to the house on 50th Avenue with this new information. Almost immediately, they started seeing the contradictions in Sarah's story. Broken glass from the windows was found outside the home, not inside, which is the opposite of what investigators would expect if someone had thrown a Molotov cocktail through the window. When investigators looked again at the burns on Sarah, the pattern didn't match someone fleeing a firebombing. It matched splash burns, which a person normally gets when they start a fire and catch the initial flare. Now, there were multiple other pieces of evidence, but the most disturbing one was found in a 4-foot-long deep freezer near where the blaze had started. The outside had been charred by the fire, but the insulation meant to keep the food frozen had also protected what was inside. When investigators opened the freezer, they found the dismembered remains of Stevie Almond, sealed in with duct tape. Her skull had been crushed by a blunt object, and her body had been cut at the arms, legs, and waist. The bathroom where Sarah had dismembered her sister had blood on all 4 walls and the ceiling. Stevie had been in the kitchen.
She got her sister and duct taped this
The entire time, while her killer, her sister, accepted the whole nation's sympathy and donations using her name. The case did not go to trial until November 2000. On November 21, the jury convicted Sarah Mitchell of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life without parole.
She looks scary. She looks scary.
On April 4th, 2024, a passerby walking through Kersal Dale in the UK found parts of a human body wrapped in cling film inside an abandoned concrete bunker. Kersal Dale is a local nature reserve along the River Irwell. It's a stretch of beach, woodland, and wetland paths used mostly by dog walkers, runners, and bird watchers. The wider Kersal area is no stranger to crime. Police have run multiple operations here over the years, targeting drug networks and gang activity. But even with that history, this was something else entirely. Detectives later described it as one of the most unprecedented investigations Greater Manchester Police have ever conducted. After finding the remains, police immediately opened a murder investigation, but no one matching the victim had been reported missing. At the time, investigators didn't know the remains belonged to a 67-year-old Stuart Everett, a retired civil servant who lived at 195 Worsley Road in the UK. Stuart had lived there since 2013. It was a modest terraced house where he was the leaseholder, and over the years he sublet the other bedrooms to...
I guarantee you it gotta be his cousin or son that stole his identity.
Polish migrants. Stuart had no kids of his own and had never married. The people closest to him were his brothers and sister in Derby, who called him Benny. Sadly, Stuart had suffered a stroke a few years back, which slowed his speech and left him walking with a stick. But it didn't stop him from helping out his community. Being the son of Polish immigrants himself, he ran English classes for the newly arrived immigrants in Manchester's Polish community. That was how he originally met a man named Marcin Majerkowicz. By 2017, Marcin had moved in with Stuart, and by 2024, they'd been living together for 7 years. In that time, the two had grown close. Close enough that Stuart had started telling friends and family Marcin was his partner. In one email from 2021, he wrote to a friend about Marcin's tattoos, his shyness, and how the two shared just about everything, including Stuart's email account. At the time, it probably...
Am I understanding it right?
Stuart, and by 2024, they'd been living together for 7 years. In that time, the two had grown close. Close enough that Stuart had started telling friends and family Marcin was his partner.
What you mean by, like, your partner?
In one email from 2021, he wrote to a friend about Marcin's tattoos, his shyness, and how the two shared just about everything, including Stuart's email account. At the time, it probably read like a harmless thing between two people who shared a home. But years later, that access would become one of the most unsettling parts of the case. Marcin was 41 years old and had been living in the UK for nearly 20 years. But by November 2023, his life started to fall apart financially. He was unemployed and had taken out roughly £60,000 in loans. He also owed another £13,000 on credit cards, which he hadn't made a payment on in months and couldn't cover his rent. By early 2024, the question was what he was willing to do about it. On the evening of March 27th, Stuart was sitting on a sofa bed in Marcin's bedroom. They were watching a football match like they did most evenings. But at some point that night, Marcin struck Stuart on the top and back of his head at least 4 times with a heavy blunt instrument, most likely a hammer. The force was severe enough to cave in Stuart's skull. Pathological evidence later showed that Stuart survived just long enough to inhale blood into his lungs before he died. But the murder itself was the first step in a disturbing plan Marcin had been building for weeks. At
8:00 new life, no debts.
11 a.m. the following morning, before moving Stuart's body, Marcin sent a message to the third housemate telling him Stuart had gone to his brother's house for Easter. In reality, he had spent the previous night dismembering Stuart's body on the bedroom floor using a knife and a hacksaw he recently bought specifically for this purpose. He separated the body into at least 27 pieces, wrapped them in cling film and bin bags, and packed them into shopping bags small enough to carry on public transport. Before 10 a.m. that same morning, he left the house carrying the first of those bags. Over the following weeks, Marcin made at least 11 separate journeys by foot and by bus, taking Stewart's remains and spreading them across the nearby area, including parks, woodlands, and nearby waterways. One of those journeys led him to Kersal Dale Nature Reserve, the place where the passerby had originally found Stewart's lower torso and legs. So, by this point, the police had part of the victim's body, but no missing person in Derby matched the description.
He is not new to this.
Unfortunately, this wasn't by accident. Disposing Stewart's body was the second part of his depraved plan. The third and final part was to steal his identity. Marcin used Stewart's phone and sent a message to his family in Derby telling them he'd fallen ill and couldn't speak on the phone anymore. So, as far as his family knew, Stewart was still alive and well and had been messaging them all week. Keeping the lie alive meant he could control Stewart's money without raising suspicion. He hired a mover to clear out Stewart's belongings and rented a dumpster to dispose of anything that was left. When the family started noticing things disappearing, he told them Stewart was moving out. At one point, he even filmed inside another property and sent them the footage as if Stewart were showing them his new place. With nobody questioning why Stewart had suddenly gone silent, Marcin started stealing everything Stewart owned. Using Stewart's login details, he changed the passwords to his bank accounts, accessed his government gateway and pension details, and even started applying for a loan in his name. But as much as he wanted to avoid a direct confrontation speaking as Stewart, he couldn't avoid it forever. When Stewart's phone company needed to deal directly with the account holder, Marcin picked up the phone and answered in a slow and slurred voice, mimicking the stroke Stewart had suffered years earlier. Even on his brother's birthday, Marcin sent a handwritten birthday card. By then, Stewart had been dead for 2 weeks. The Greater Manchester Police's specialized CCTV unit had started reviewing
do y'all still write people birthday letters? And like, do people like birthday letters? But that's like, nah, they just send me a text. Or it is what it is.
Thousands of hours of footage from the surrounding area. Eventually, they identified a figure they started calling the Heavy Bag Man, who stood out because of the way he moved. On CCTV, he could be seen leaving the house with heavy bags and visibly struggling with the weight, and later returning empty-handed. Investigators traced his bus journeys and slowly narrowed his home area down to Winton. They started spending time in the area looking for more CCTV footage. On April 25, 2 of them were driving an unmarked car when one of the investigators glanced at a man in a dark beanie and recognized him. They followed him to the bus stop and called for backup. Before the bus drove away, a uniformed officer stepped in and pulled Marcin out in handcuffs.
Be inside, you're detained for the purpose of a search while we ascertain your identity, okay?
Or if you could pass me your mobile number for
Just one stand up first.
Can you double check, please?
Got to check his pockets.
It's definitely a mistake. 100%.
I know, I appreciate that. All we've had is information passed to us from officers investigating a serious matter as to whether you may be involved.
Something happened on like I
not
told
right
you.
now. Not today, but it has happened recently, okay?
In his possession at that moment were Stuart Everett's phone and bank cards. Investigators later found out that Marcin was planning to permanently leave the country that day and had been searching for properties in Spain weeks earlier. Marcin was charged with murder. His trial began at Manchester.
Bro, it's like soon as you think you gotta wait, the day you leave is the day them niggas pick you up. He was this close. He was this close. If that police officer made his business for 5 minutes, he would have been gone.
Crown Court nearly a year later in March 2025. Marcin never testified at trial. When the verdict was read, he showed no emotion and never apologized to Stewart's family. Only a third of Stewart's body was ever recovered, and Marcin refused to assist investigators in locating the rest. He was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 34 years.
Marcin Mierkiewicz.
The hairstyle is crazy.
For the murder of...
Bro, what made him say, I go to the barber shop and be like, curl it.
Stuart Everett, I sentence you to imprisonment for life.
That's a bad
Taking
hairstyle,
account
gang.
of all the relevant circumstances and the aggravating and mitigating factors that I have set out, the appropriate minimum term will be 34 years.
The judge confirmed the murder was premeditated and motivated entirely by financial gain. 5 days before the killings, he'd looked up how much it would cost to borrow £50,000. With £60,000 in unpaid loans, credit card debts, and unpaid rent, Marston's answer to his money problems turned out to be Stewart's life. A life which was brutally ended, and for weeks after, his identity was stolen by his killer. On August 29, 2010, a group of trail bike riders cutting through the fire trails of Belanglo State Forest between Sydney and Canberra, Australia, found human bones scattered across the forest floor. Among the remains was a skull. There was also a small silver earring, a single child-sized sock, and a decomposed women's t-shirt with one word printed across the front: angelic. For the next 5 years, that word was almost all the evidence investigators had about the victim. They ran her DNA against every state and federal database and cross-checked her against every open missing persons report in the country. But no one matching her description had ever been reported missing. This could have meant one of two things. Either no one was looking for her, or someone had made it look like there was no reason to. Because of how little evidence the case produced, investigators named her the Angel of Belanglo. By late 2011, the case had been open for over a year without any progress. With no leads left, police reconstructed the woman's face from her skull and recovered hair, hoping someone in the public might recognize her. The result was a haunting image. When the sketch was released, 35 tips came in from people who thought they recognized her. Sadly, every single one of them fell apart on follow-ups. By 2015, 5 years had passed, and the Angel of Belanglo was still unidentified. The only people trying to figure out her identity were the police, which raised a disturbing question. Why hadn't the family of the victim reported her missing? Or did they think she was still alive? Her real name was found out to be Carly Pierce Stevenson, a 22-year-old mother from Alice Springs in Australia's Northern Territory. She had given birth to a baby girl, Candelise, in 2006 when she was only 17. By late 2008, Carly had been seeing a 34-year-old man named Daniel Hold'em for around 2 months and wanted a fresh start. So, in early November, she packed her car and left Alice Springs with him and Candelise. To Carly's family, the decision came out of nowhere. Her aunt Sharon would later tell 60 Minutes Australia that the announcement was, quote, a bit of a shock. Their plan was to head south down the Stewart Highway and find work in Adelaide. By mid-November 2008, Carly's life started falling apart. She called Tanya Weber her mother's best friend and the closest thing she had to a second mother. She was crying and saying she'd made a mistake